Good morning, everybody. Let's find a nice place to sit and we'll get rolling. Nice to see you all this morning. A few notes before we get started. A week from today is Ash Wednesday, and so we begin the season of Lent. A week from today, we will have Bible study, normal time next week, even though it's Ash Wednesday, but you're invited to just make a plan to stay. So we have a service at early morning, and then we've got one at noon. And so if you all come physically to Bible study, it might be nice and convenient for you to stay and go to the noon service, which would be great. If that doesn't work for you, we've got many other services, including a family service at 5 o'clock on Ash Wednesday. So if you have kids and want to bring them to be part of that service, 5 o'clock is completely geared toward families and children. And then we've got a choral experience at 7 o'clock that night. 7 a.m. is right here in the chapel, and it is just the service of Ash Wednesday, which does not have communion. It's none of that. It's the prayers, it's the confessions, it's the imposition of ashes, but it's only that. And so it's a really nice way, if you are off somewhere else, or those of you watching online who can't physically be here in the morning, 7 a.m. right here in the chapel is a beautiful way to just get your ashes, start your Lent off right, get to work, no problem. And so that schedule is all on our website, stmichael.org. So visit there and know that there are lots of ways that we support you. So if you are maybe new to St. Michael, if you are not a member of St. Michael, but you like some of the things that we offer, then know that we do weekday meditations throughout the season of Lent, led by the clergy. They are less than 10 minutes, and it's a great way, whether you're in the car or if you're brushing your teeth or whatever. You don't have to tell us what you're doing, but just kind of say your prayers with us, and it's a really nice way to center yourself every day. And in addition to that, we've got some Wednesday experiences after Ash Wednesday. So in 2 weeks from today, we will have recitals here at noon in the chapel, followed by a Eucharist service at 12:30. So you could make an entire day on Wednesday, Bible study, a Lenten recital, a Eucharist at 12:30. So those are really nice. And then the evenings on Wednesday nights, just in Lent, beginning a week after Ash Wednesday, so 2 weeks from today, we will have Wednesday evening programs that are really meant to bring everyone together. So there is a dinner at 6. There's a prayer and a program at 6:30 that ends with Compline, and everyone's invited. We'll have some experiences for children. It will be specifically for adults. There will be meditation books that are given out that we will track week by week on Lent on Wednesdays. And so if you want to just add something to your regular routine that helps you a bit just for those 6 weeks, there are a number of ways you can do that, or do all of it. It will only help. And so I hope you will take advantage of that this Lent, and next week we kick it off. Let's have a prayer, and we'll jump into John chapter 13. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, as we near your holy season of Lent, we ask that you help us to see the work that you began so many years ago in faithful people who carried it on, that we can receive that torch, receive that baton, and continue to run the race, even when it is hard, even when it is inconvenient, even when it feels like it taxes us. We are made to do your work, made to love the people in your world. And when we fulfill that purpose, we are filled up. Be with all of us today, especially those we hold in the silence of our hearts and our minds. Be with those who need your healing touch, especially those who may be nearing the end of their life, that our prayers and your presence will lift them up. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, so we are now in John chapter 13. As I noted last week, chapters 11 and 12 are kind of a pivot from the first half of John, which is really the book of signs, to the second half of John, which really is the passion of Jesus. And we talked a little bit about what the passion means. I got a question over the week that I found very interesting, and I want to just kind of introduce the idea to you, and we will touch on this idea many times over these next few months. The question essentially is around the idea of Jesus's purpose. We will see today in chapter 13 that we talk about the time has come. And so that time having come really connects with Jesus' purpose. And the question is, whether Jesus felt that his purpose was not yet fulfilled until this moment. The fulfilling of Jesus' purpose. This is a big idea. I want to simply introduce the idea to you so you can pray on it and think about it. And as we go over the next couple months, you can consider the way in which this might impact you. Jesus' purpose, we know now, in hindsight, was fulfilled through his death and resurrection. The question I want to ask you is whether or not it was necessary for what happened to Jesus to actually fulfill his purpose. This is a challenging question. I'm not going to tell you what I think. I want you to think about how you might consider this. It is so easy for us as Christians, especially those of us who grew up in the church, to just immediately say, of course it was. Was it? Could God only do what was done in exactly the way it was done? It is totally fine for you to lean into a yes. Like the entire thing was planned. God knew from the very beginning, this is exactly what was going to happen. And piece by piece by piece, everything fell into place and everything was done just right. I also think it is very faithful for us to lean into an idea that Jesus came without knowing exactly what was going to happen. Now, maybe broadly speaking, like he kind of had that direction. But how things played out was actually done within the relationships he developed. And it was those relationships that helped to guide what actually happened in the literal sense. And yes, of course, God fulfilled what God wanted done. But did it have to be fulfilled in that exact same way in which it was? Or could the purpose have been done differently? Now, that's enough. And so just put that in your pocket. Don't worry about it. Oh my gosh, I cannot even tell you the way that some people's faces are right now. It is like so, I'm not sure if it's confusion, if it's you're appalled, if there's this, I don't know, whatever. So just receive that. That's a little seed to be planted and go off and just kind of think about that. And we've got many, many, many weeks to really roll this idea around because almost the entire rest of our study of John is going to be the Passion. And so we have a lot of time to turn that crystal and to vet this idea for us because I do think the ripples of this question impact how we think God works in the world right now, how we work in the world right now, what we are called into for the future, and it can be pretty dynamic. So just, you're welcome. Okay. We're looking at chapter 13, and there are 4 sections to chapter 13. First, we're going to simply set the scene, and it's the very first verse of the chapter. Second part, we're going to discuss the washing of the disciples' feet. Part 3, we're going to discuss Judas and that moment when Judas receives the bread and then leaves. And then part 4, we're going to speak of the new commandment that Jesus leaves for the disciples that actually begins a very long, multi-chapter discourse. So let's start with the very first verse of chapter 13. It is a big verse. There's a whole lot in these very few words. And so I'm just going to read the first verse, and then we're going to talk about the 3 big ideas that set the entire tableau of what's going on at this dinner. Chapter 13, verse 1 reads, "Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." And then we'll stop there. This is an entire setting of the scene, of the entire rest of the gospel. So let's start with the first piece we see in verse 1. That is, it's the festival of the Passover. Now at this point, I hope we know that John uses festivals not to simply mark the time of the year, but to somehow illuminate what is happening in the story. There is always some connection being made between whatever the festival has meant up to that point and how Jesus is functioning in the world and what Jesus's presence is actually doing to expand and develop the idea of whatever that festival was. Passover is the festival of festivals. This is the big one. I believe we remember what Passover is, but just so we're on the same page, Passover is the moment when the Israelites were still enslaved in Egypt, when the 10th plague occurred, and the angel of death passed over the Israelites so that their firstborn children did not die. So the people who were faithful within the Israelite community did not experience the death of their firstborn. The Egyptians did, and it was really the final straw that pushed Egypt to allow the Israelites to leave. The actual Passover moment, although they were saved physically from death in that moment, really pointed toward what ultimately happened when they were freed from slavery. So although Passover is important, Passover only points to what is essentially even more important, and that is when they were freed and they left Egypt. Way bigger than just a moment when some people didn't die. What Jesus is doing now, what John is doing in his narrative, is he's saying what happened at that first Passover moment was a big deal. But that Passover moment only points to this Passover moment. And through Jesus, an even bigger thing is happening. So if we can imagine in kind of the hierarchy of good things, the first moment of Passover, when the oldest child of every family was spared physical death, was a very good thing. But when we look at the Israelites leaving Egypt and being spared from being enslaved for generations, that's an even gooder thing, right? That's a bigger good. Then if we think about what Jesus is doing, and Jesus is offering us salvation beyond even the physical reality itself, but eternal life, salvation forever, defeating death even itself, that's an even better good. And so we're talking about a little good, a bigger good, and the best good. And so Jesus is really developing this best good so that everybody understands the gravity of what's happening in his passion. Questions about that? Yes.
Okay. Going back to your big question about did this have to happen and did Jesus...
Why are you going back to the question I said we're not doing that? Go ahead.
Just referencing it.
Okay, sure.
It says here that he knew his time had come to leave the world.
Yeah. So that's part 2. We haven't even gotten there yet. Okay. So any questions about the Passover? We all understand kind of how this is stair-stepping into something, the big thing? Great. Part 2. Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Pam's question here is about knowledge. When one knows something, does that assume one knew before one knows? Well, of course not. I know everyone who is here. Did I know that 30 minutes ago? Of course not. So just because I know something now doesn't mean I knew it before it happened. So to say that Jesus knew the time had come does not necessarily mean that he knew, say, 3 months earlier that would be his time. Now, could he have? Of course. I never want to put a limit on God. Did God know something? I'm going to go with yes. But as Jesus is experiencing this, and even more importantly, as John is telling of Jesus' experience of this, I don't want us to go beyond the page first. As we are doing this Bible study, step 1 is let's make sure we know what is actually written. Let's not read into what is actually written. Once we are very clear what is actually on the page, then we launch from the page. And I've discussed this a little bit before. There are these 2 terms in biblical study. One is exegesis, and that is where you really know what's on the page, and then you use that as your launching point to try to develop ideas that then could take action in the world, teachings, and that sort of stuff. Exegesis. The other is eisegesis. That's when you take whatever you think and you make what it says on the page agree with whatever you think. Eisegesis is super dangerous. And almost always, and I say almost always because probably not every single time, almost always, if you were to take the theologies of different denominations of Christianity, say, and say, well, why do Episcopalians think one thing and non-denominational groups think something else? It's almost certainly going to boil down to the difference between exegesis and eisegesis. And not to say that everybody's all one or all the other. We're all a mix of both. But it sure is great if we can slide to the side of the scale that is a whole lot more exegesis than it is eisegesis. We're human. There's only so much that we can limit of ourselves being brought to the page, of course. But if we can kind of get close to the 90-10 of the exegesis-eisegesis piece, we're doing pretty good. If we flip the other way and it's like 10-90, that's a real problem. And so part of what we are doing in these classes is we're trying to consider genuinely what is written, not what we think is written. And once we know what is written, then rather than what we think is written, we can go from what is written into something that is more deeper. More deeper, good for me. That is something that is deeper. Okay. Let's then talk about this second point. His time had come. Now we know that John has been using the idea of Jesus' time ever since the beginning of the gospel. So Jesus has said in many places, my time has not yet come, my time has not yet come, my time has not yet come. Now we hear the time has come. And so this is a very strong flag in the ground to say not only is there something new happening with the Passover, but now is the time. All the things that have happened up to this point have pointed to this moment. And by moment, we really stretch it out like this week. Like what will happen over these next few days? That is what we have been waiting for. That is what we have been preparing for this entire time. What is interesting for us to ask is how John emphasizes Jesus' death. John's story emphasizes Jesus died and was raised to new life, and it's Jesus' death and resurrection that redefines death and eternal life for all of us. We don't want to make this too simple, because if we were to ask ourselves, what is it time for? It might be that we say it's time for Jesus to go to heaven. A little too easy. It's time for Jesus to die. That's not quite enough. We have to somehow bring these two together. The time is the entire act, Jesus submitting himself to the pain and the torture and the physical death in order for Jesus to then be raised to new life. That's the idea that we get, especially in John. And it is that raising to new life that redefines what resurrection even is. Remember, resurrection is not a new idea, but Jesus is redefining the idea of resurrection from what it had been over at least the last 150 to 200 years before his life. The idea of resurrection was kind of around earlier than that, but as we know, it's after the Maccabean revolt that the idea of resurrection really begins to take hold, and Jesus steps into that moment and says, let me tell you what resurrection really is. And it is the entire action that begins with his submission and arrest, and it ends with his ascension. All of that becomes one whole act that redefines everything people had known up to that point, and then sets a new stage for us. So as disciples after that fact, we then plant ourselves in a new reality. But it takes the entire act, not any one component or piece of it. Questions about that? Yes?
It sounds like you're saying that there is a very distinct difference between resuscitation and resurrection.
Do you have a question?
Was resuscitation the definition of resurrection before Jesus' new definition?
Oh, thank you. Great question. So, yes, there's definitely a difference between resuscitation and resurrection. So the idea of like you've been dead for 3 or 4 minutes and then you're back to life, that's not the kind of resurrection we're talking about. Before this moment, for the people living at this time with Jesus, the last century or two had seen the development of resurrection to begin to answer the question, like, what actually happens after death? People were asking, because early Judaism, it was all about how you live now. Because once you're dead, you're dead. That was just it. So you're alive right now, how you live matters. And so almost everything about early Judaism had to do with choices you make right now in your life. For 100 to 200 years before Jesus' life, that began to shift a bit, so that the question of could there be something after death was asked, and asked very clearly. And so there were branches of Judaism that began to say, well, something's going to happen. We know the prophets spoke of resurrection. What does that really mean? And so there began to be this question of, at some point, the people who are dead are no longer dead. How does that work? And so the idea of the second coming, in a sense, of the Messiah began to take shape. And Messiah began to be far more important because, broadly speaking, there was going to be a point at which God recreated everything and fixed all the mess. And when God fixes all the mess, part of the fix becomes everybody, all the faithful people who had died, they come to life again. And it's not meant to be, and it's not a zombie thing. It's this complete new creation. Because in the great arc of Judaism, God created first, the creation got messed up, and it's through the Messiah that God will save the creation. And in order to save the creation, it is recreated. And so that recreation will happen at some point. So resurrection, before Jesus, really was linked to recreation. What Jesus does is he takes that and he shifts the whole thing. Because it's not just a future promise, but there is a present reality. The salvation of the resurrection promise happens now. Then we get to ask the question, well, then does that mean upon death, everyone immediately goes to heaven? Maybe. Could it mean that it's a transition? Maybe. Does it mean that the promise comes at some future point? Maybe. And then where's heaven? Up in the clouds? No. There is a lot that we can do from that question, and we will do more of that over the next few weeks. For now, to simply know that as this scene is set, not only is Jesus doing something new around Passover, Jesus is doing something new around death itself. Follow up? Number 3. Jesus says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. What John does is he says everything that will happen from this point on is explicitly, inextricably connected to love. The whole purpose of what God is doing and will do is because of God's deep love for us. Now, love, it's important, and we will kind of turn this over again. Love is not a feeling first. Love is an action first. If you then feel it, great. But John is setting up, and will in the rest of this chapter begin to kind of do some exposition around this idea that the act of love is most important. And so part of what we get here is this whole scene set, that Passover is being redone, that Jesus is now here and the time has come, and everything he does is because we are loved. Okay, that's verse 1. Questions? The scene is set. Let's keep going to washing the disciples' feet. Let's look at verse 2. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." We'll stop there. Let's talk about foot washing. Who's ever participated in sacred foot washing? Not like when you shower. Yes, okay, a few, good. We recognize this moment every year in our Maundy Thursday service. And we get to the point in the worship service where we do a foot washing. The first time I participated in a real sacred foot washing was when I was a youth minister. And we were on a retreat. And the retreat is 3 days long, called Happening, and all of the teens spend multiple days kind of breaking down all their walls and their barriers and finding friendships and eating lots of sugar. And at one point, once evening falls, there is an entire progressive worship experience that really culminates in a foot washing. And so these people who are now new friends begin to wash one another's feet. And it's really, really beautiful. In this scene of foot washing, it's dangerous for it to become performative. And that's really what we see in Peter's misunderstanding here. Jesus goes around washing feet because washing feet was a very normal thing to do at this period of time. We know that they wore sandals. And so as people are walking around on these, dirty, dusty roads, feet just get dirty. And so it's very normal before one eats to wash feet because you kind of get rid of all the dirt, particularly for those who will be reclining at the table. And we'll talk about the way that that kind of physically works. People are not sitting on chairs at tables like we do now. People are more so leaning back in pillows. Think of like the way you see like Greek philosophers eating and things like that. It was important to wash feet because you don't take the dirt where the food is. And so that was super common. Very uncommon for the feet to be washed by the leader. That's really different. And so Peter immediately rejects this. And he says, "You can't do this. This is the job for a servant." And Jesus, in a sense, says, "You don't understand yet what I am doing, but you will." And by "you will," the way that John structures this is that over the next few chapters, Jesus reinforces again and again and again what servanthood really is around love and the discipleship that he's calling his followers into there, and then of course us now, is servanthood. And so we'll talk a bit more about that in just a minute. When I first started as a priest, and I began considering what foot washing has become, it was unfortunately very performative. And so what my experience, and I'll say this, I really don't like foot washing. And in the Maundy Thursday, any of the Altar Guild members know that I'm the one who, when the foot washing starts, I will do what I'm supposed to do, and then I will vanish. And so this is my confession to you. When you come to the Maundy Thursday service, you'll see me walk somewhere, and you'll think to yourself, he must be doing something important. No, I don't like it. And so I actually just leave, because I would rather not even do it. And for some people, there's this beautiful nature about foot washing. But the problem for me with the way that we do it, I don't mean we, St. Michael, I mean we, like just most Christian churches do it, is we don't earn the moment. We've not built up to it in a way that makes it as powerful as I think it could be. So when I first started, what I saw was that often priests would just wash each other's feet. That's pretty bad. Even worse is the way that was happening here, which was the priests wash parishioners' feet. The only people washing are the priests. That's worse. Even worse that I have seen is where parishioners wash the priest's feet. Oh, it's all gross. And so part of what I struggle with in this moment is that the foot washing moment here between Jesus and his disciples is as intimate as it can be. Washing a stranger's feet is a good attempt at getting to that intimacy. So it does no harm unless we misunderstand that we're really meant to be serving. So let me tell you what I like most. This is the best I can do of this, because if we're going to do it, which I was told we have to do it, then fine. Then the way that I like it being done is that whole families come up together and they wash each other's feet. And so let me tell you, the best of a Maundy Thursday foot washing for me is when families come up and you see like a child wash their mother's feet. That to me is the best, that's the closest we can get in that sort of sacred moment where the person who tends to be the one who is benefiting from all the service, a child basically benefits from everything a parent does for them all the time. If in that moment, that child who is constantly served becomes the one serving, that gets as close as we can get. That's really nice. And the rest of it is fine. It does no harm. But it is very easy for us to feel very good about doing something performative, because then we're like Jesus. No, we're not. We are doing something that Jesus did, but if all we're doing is the physical act that Jesus did, man, we miss the whole point. Because Jesus washing the feet, just like Jesus says to Peter, you don't even understand what I'm doing. That's what I would say to anybody who thinks who leaves a Maundy Thursday service thinking they're such like Jesus. No, you don't even understand what you just did. Part of what a foot washing does is it invites people in to actually become a servant. And this we really resist. Now, we might like it in theory. We might even agree with it in principle. But we don't want to do it. And we will try our very best to make as good quality excuse as we can to not actually serve. We have everything ready. Every one of us in this room, we have a laundry list ready to say why it is that we don't serve as much as we could. And it's all going to be something about we don't have time, we're not sure how, we don't, wah, wah, wah. It's all it is excuses. Every one of us. Jesus is pushing on us because the servant nature of love is what he really wants us to hold. It's that servanthood of love that is the greatest challenge of our discipleship. We can know a whole lot, and we can even feel a whole lot. But if we don't do it, then all the thinking and the feeling is useless. And so it is the act of love that is so critically important to what is being represented here by Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Now I want to get to Peter's objection to Jesus washing his feet. Because Peter speaks for, I think, all of us in our humanness. We don't wish to be served either. And that's the great irony. Because we all kind of in this false humility are like, no, let me do the serving. Whatever. If that was really true, we would be doing a whole lot more. But there's this moment of, I don't really want to be served. Okay. Well, I don't really want to serve either. I'd really kind of rather not do either. And that's probably where most of us live most of the time, is we don't wish to be served because that kind of seems a little, selfish, although we like it. And then We don't really want to serve because we just it doesn't feel right, and we don't like it. We don't like it is the theme here, by the way. The human expression of Jesus serving is something that I want us to turn around a little bit beyond the foot washing. Peter has multiple times resisted the idea of Jesus' death. That is a very common theme in John. And we, of course, can attribute that to Peter as a person, but I do think that John uses Peter as kind of a foil for the disciples or for humanity. He kind of speaks for us. And that goes all the way to his denial. I mean, when we get to his denial, it is, I will go ahead and tell you, it will completely choke me up to talk about what happens with Peter after the fact and when Jesus sees him again. Because it is the most human of everything in the entire story. And what we see of God through Jesus is the love is so complete that it doesn't matter what we do. God loves us unconditionally all the time. And what we see is Peter in this moment, and Peter will come back again and again, is that Peter says he doesn't want Jesus to die. He doesn't want Jesus to serve. He doesn't want Jesus to submit himself to whatever it is that Jesus thinks he's going to do. And Peter knows Jesus is doing something. Something is happening in this moment. And Peter articulates, like, I know something's going on, so get up. Don't do whatever you're doing, which is really Peter's way of saying, let's not do any of this. Let's stop. Let's leave Jerusalem. Let's go. We don't even need to be here. Whatever's about to happen, I don't even know what's going to happen. Whatever's happening, I don't want to do it. I don't want you to have to do it. Let's go. Peter grabs on to the fear that we all have around death. None of us want to die. None of us want to see loved ones die. Death is very scary. We know all about the way that death can scare us and push us into places where we think we are secure. Making ourselves uncomfortable is not what we like. We don't want to be pushed out of our secure zones. We like to rest in whatever kind of false security that we think we have and pretend like we can never be hurt. But in this narrative, John's pushing us out of that kind of feeling of comfort and security. We know how reactive we can be when it comes to being pushed out of our comfort zones. I mean, for God's sake, we're in a church. So we know what it means to not get what we like. We tend to rebel. We tend to complain. We tend to fight. That idea of not getting what we like is representative right here in what Peter says to Jesus. Part of our faith, part of being in a community like this, is actually allowing ourselves to be servants first, allowing ourselves to follow a particular path that puts others ahead of ourselves. This is really hard stuff because this is completely counter to our human nature. And I don't mean like some theoretical human nature. I mean the evolved nature that we have inside us to survive. We have this core in us that is invested in our survival to the bitter end. So our natural, thoughtless way to react to being uncomfortable or being threatened is to fight. And so for us to fight or flight, to just walk away and leave, either one, that is what we are attempting to resist in our discipleship. God's calling us into a way of being that actually is counter to the biological way in which that our species has survived. And that then requires us to practice again and again. This is not a thing we can really think ourselves out of. This is something that we can't feel ourselves out of. Again, it's like love. We have to act and behave ourselves out of this fight or flight kind of response to being made uncomfortable. Let's look at verse 12 and the way that Jesus seems to answer this challenge from Peter. After Jesus had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. I am not speaking of all of this to you. I know whom I have chosen, but it is to fulfill the scripture. The one who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I tell you this now before it occurs, so that when it does occur, you may believe that I am he. Very truly I tell you, whoever receives one whom I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me." Jesus says very powerfully, if you know these things, verse 17. So if you know what it is I'm doing, you know what I've called you into, and you know how you're supposed to behave, you're blessed if you do them. He draws a very clear line. It doesn't matter what you know or how you feel. It only matters if you put your knowing and your feeling into action. And it's the doing that matters the most. Okay, we're going to get to Judas here in a moment. Questions or comments? Really? Okay, you can ponder. I will say this is the part of John that has worried me from the very beginning, because it gets repetitive and redundant, and John's kind of saying the same thing over and over and over again in different ways, which is not a problem literarily, but for me to have to teach, hours on kind of the same idea is going to be a challenge. But anyway, we'll get through it together. Pray for me. Okay, let's go on with Judas. We come to a shift in this moment. Up to now, we've had this lovely dinner. Jesus has washed the feet. We've had this nice exchange. Now it's kind of like we get to where the rubber hits the road. This is a pivot point, because at this point, the drama kind of starts to come. I mean, Judas brings the drama, and Judas's entire story brings the drama. And so let's set the scene one more time. We are at dinner, and everyone sits around the table on the floor, on pillows, and reclining and eating. This is a very relaxing kind of way of eating. So many of the images you've seen of the Last Supper that include chairs, not correct. Really, these people would have been lying around together, and they're not even that physically close to each other. And so what we see in the next scene is this weird, like passing notes in class kind of thing, where Jesus says a thing and then Peter hears it, but he's not entirely sure what Jesus means, but Peter's not close enough to Jesus to ask him, and he's not going to yell across the room to Jesus. So he kind of passes the note to John, the beloved disciple, who happens to be reclining next to Jesus, for John to ask Jesus what Jesus meant before Jesus hands the bread to Judas. So that's kind of what happens in this moment. And so it can be a little confusing if we don't know the physicality of the setup of the table. The beloved disciple, John, who we'll see again at the foot of the cross, could be John the gospel writer. If I'm put money on the table, I would say it's not the same person, but perhaps John the gospel writer is actually one of John the beloved disciple's students, is probably really the way this worked. But it is probably John, the beloved disciple, who is reclining next to Jesus in this next scene, who has told the story of Jesus in the way that we have received it in John's gospel. So that I am totally fine with. He may not have physically been the writer, but he definitely told the story this way. So let's look at verse 21. After saying all of this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, "Very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Jesus said to him, "Do quickly what you are going to do." Now no one at the table knew why he had said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the common purse, Jesus was telling him, "Buy what we need for the festival," or that he should go give something to the poor. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. This scene is a little odd to me because they're all at dinner, and Jesus is saying weird stuff. And I think at this point, if I were one of the disciples, I know I am mouthier than most people, but if I were one of the disciples, I'd be like, "What do you mean, Jesus?" And they don't seem to want to ask that question. It's sort of like Jesus says a thing, and the way John tells the story, everyone went, "Huh." Well, they talk to each other, so I don't entirely know exactly why that would have been the case, but the way the story arc happens here is Judas, who is marked as the person who will betray Jesus, and Jesus knows it, is identified by Jesus in this public moment, but in an incredibly intimate way. By dipping bread or by preparing food and handing it to someone, you're really acting out an intimate relationship. You don't do that for people you don't care for at this period of time. And so in that context, the disciples would have understood Jesus' love for Judas very profoundly. And yet, Jesus has just revealed to John, the beloved disciple, that the person who receives the bread is going to betray him. So in this moment, there is this deep love and deep connection between Jesus and Judas and the potential or the predicted betrayal. You all have heard me teach on Judas, I think, or maybe some of you have heard this before. I have a very different interpretation of Judas than is most common. Essentially, and we'll get to this when we get to the actual betrayal, I'll kind of unpack this a bit more. I've always thought that Judas is impatient, but very faithful. And that Judas, perhaps even more than any of the other disciples, wanted Jesus to do the thing that he believed Jesus was coming to do. And remember, what is the idea of the Messiah? The Messiah will overthrow the oppressor. And so for them at this point in time, that's Rome. And so I've always understood Judas to be the person who just wanted Jesus to do the thing that he believed Jesus was going to do. Overthrow Rome already. Like, we've been watching you walk around, do some stuff that's great. Rome is still in charge. Get rid of them. Kick them out. And so in a sense, Judas's betrayal of Jesus pushes Jesus into a corner. And I genuinely think Judas thought Jesus was going to be like, boom, and he was going to like overthrow. Fine. Then he just like waves his hand and overthrows Rome and everything is put right. And Judas completely misunderstands the purpose of Jesus's life. And that's ultimately why he falls into despair. So we'll get there. I'll say more about that there. But I do think that John's story can illuminate that particular interpretation of Judas. And let me tell you why. We see in this passage that Judas receives the bread and then Satan comes into him. What this is not a demon possession. We've seen that already where Jesus cleanses people of demons. Okay, we know that happens. The word here, Satan, in both the Hebrew and the Greek, doesn't equate to the kind of demonic possession that other parts of the story allude to. This is much more the idea of being tempted by something evil. Satan, in the Hebrew and the Greek, can often mean adversary or accuser or false believer. It contains in it this tempted nature. And of course, after Jesus' baptism and he goes out and is tempted by Satan, he's not possessed by a demon. He faces the strongest temptation away from God's purpose. And so in this moment, what Judas is doing is he is succumbing to the temptation, very strong temptation, away from God's purpose, away from what Jesus came to do. And so that giving in to temptation is what Jesus understands. And so Jesus, also in his humanity, makes such a great statement. Jesus hands the piece of bread to Judas. The Satan comes into Judas, and Jesus says, do what you're going to do, but quick. Jesus says, it's going to be hard. He knows it's going to be hard. He knows he will be tortured. He knows it will be painful. He knows his heart will be broken. So just do it quickly. And so in this moment, we see that Jesus is pretty aware of what's coming. And so he's accepted it. He just would, in his humanness, like it to be fast. Judas then leaves, and we're told something interesting about Judas going out and potentially giving money to the poor. Judas did hold the money, and so Judas being tempted by the money makes a lot of sense. Usually, the people who have the most money are most tempted by money. Oh, that hurt, didn't it? So, part of what we see here is the money manager is the one who sees the money being offered, and that is contained and a big part of his personal temptation away from God's purpose, so that he then begins to play a role in everything that falls out from here on in. Okay, questions about that? Yes?
In verse 2 of 13, it says, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas. So, does that mean that the darkness was already into Judas?
Yeah, so we see in verse 2, I'm getting there. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Iscariot, to betray Jesus. So Judas is...
Jesus that gave him that.
I'm sorry, say again?
It wasn't only Jesus that, when he dipped the water in the bread and the wine, it was, the devil was, I'm confused.
Yes. So instead of reading the devil or Satan, transfer the word to temptation. And I think it makes more sense. So the temptation was already in Judas to betray Jesus. Upon the moment when Jesus gives the bread, that temptation took hold of him. And so he left. If we flip that word, for us, and again, I know I've said this multiple times, but it's important. When we hear Satan, we immediately personify Satan. It's a person. It's that on your, the person on your shoulder, it's the tail with the point, it's the pitchfork, and it's the dancing fire, and it's all the things. And so it's important for us to put all that aside and to say that the actual use of that word in the ancient Hebrew for sure, but also in the Greek, is really about serious temptation. It's not about a person doing a thing, or it's not about a demon coming into a person. We can make it too physical. And here's the danger of that. By making the Satan too physical, there's a whole bunch of theological stuff about that, like dualism and whatever. We can talk about that some other time if you want. Here's why I think it's dangerous for us. It is too easy to make Judas out to be an exception. And Judas is not an exception. Judas is us. And if we make it out to be like Satan came down and grabbed Judas by the neck and that sort of stuff, then it's easy, like Satan's never done that to me. But if it becomes just temptation, now that's all of us. Judas's story and why I was going to say, why I like my interpretation most, of course I do. But the reason that I really landed on this interpretation of Judas is because it makes Judas in this story the person I can relate to most. I don't relate most to John. the beloved. I'm not that nice. I don't relate most to Peter because I'm actually not a flight kind of person. I'm a fight person. I relate most to Judas because Judas allows his impatience to tempt him to take action when it was not God's purpose. That for me, now it may not be for you. You may ID with someone else more so in the story. But for me, patience is not my virtue. And it is so easy for me to be impatient and to try to jump to conclusions and to take action without having really been present to God enough to allow God to form whatever action I will take. And then it's a bit more ego than it should be God. And I think that's what's happening here with Judas. And Judas, I think, means well. But his intention is super misguided. To me, that is my personal challenge, and I think that's probably where, I would venture to say that's where most people land, is that we can so easily be tempted to do or not do things that really have nothing to do with God, but with very good intentions. And our good intentions can often hide the actual impact of our actions. And so we can do and not do things, but with good intentions, and so let ourselves off the hook. We are not meant, this is not meant to be a story that should shame us, nor do I think it's a story that should shame Judas, but it should be realistic. And so for us to flip those words to be temptation makes it really uncomfortably realistic for me. And it's a challenge to continue to try to be better than that, to be more patient, to be more faithful, to allow God in to help make decisions most thoughtfully and not jump too quickly. And I think that that's really what Judas represents. Any other questions or thoughts? Oh, hello. 1, 2, go ahead.
You remind me of some patience with my children when they don't move as quickly in the right direction causes me to jump in and make things happen.
Yeah.
For me, that personally is something. Without Judas betraying Jesus, would the passion still happen? It's just a convenient accelerant for the fire.
That's a good question. So, question is, without Judas, would everything in the passion that's about to happen have happened? Now that gets at what I opened with. And that's what I want you to wonder. There is no real answer. At some point, not today, I'll probably tell you what I think. But maybe not. I'm not sure. I haven't decided yet. I want you to wonder that, though. If Judas hadn't done this, would everything else that had happened happen? And obviously, we can look back in hindsight and say, well, every single action or decision impacts the future. So I don't mean like literally what everything had happened, but I think the larger question you're asking is, did Judas have to do what he did in order to get to the point at which Jesus was crucified? So that is important for us to wonder. That's what I want us wondering over this next, really like 6 more weeks of this, before we kind of get to the meat of the moment when Jesus is crucified. We've got time. Don't push it. Let that marinate a little bit. Allow yourself to wonder just how much of this is perhaps planned, and how much of this did Jesus or God or whomever kind of just wait to see what decisions they made, because they may have made decisions. I mean, I want to think that somewhere in Jesus' heart, as he handed the bread to Judas, he thought maybe Judas wouldn't go. Just a little. Even if he knew Judas would go, he kind of hoped maybe just a little Judas wouldn't. And so that's the kind of idea that I would want us to play with. Where is God when it comes to the plan and the response? That's a huge, huge question, and I think it's worth our time.
He took my look.
You took the question. Okay, good. I saw another. Yes.
I was thinking that Judas might just be representative of all the other people that thought like him. And maybe it wasn't necessary for Judas necessarily to do what he did because other people who thought like him would have gotten there themselves.
It's a very good point to make that Judas could be representative of the general feeling of lots of people. Judas may have been the one who did that thing that then triggered a whole bunch of things afterwards. But Judas represented a movement that we know was happening, like from the moment Jesus healed Lazarus and brought him back from the dead. There was tons of grumbling all around. And so there were lots and lots of people who were moving against Jesus. Judas, even if he didn't do it, would someone have done it? I think it's a very wise way to look at this. We are now out of time. It makes good sense because the next section of chapter 13 is really more about the discourses that come than the action that we've discussed. And so we're going to end 13 next week and go right on into 14. And until then, I appreciate you, and I'll see you then. Bye.